Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Laura Shrake and I am the Senior Program Director for Business and Sustainability at the Council of the Great Lakes Region. And it is a pleasure to welcome you to our monthly webinar series. The Council of the Great Lakes Region is a binational network of organizations focused on accelerating the transition to a sustainable future in the Great Lakes region. And we are bringing diverse perspectives and interests together to explore and solve our most pressing socioeconomic and environmental challenges. This webinar series is an important aspect of that work. Through this virtual platform, our guests share knowledge and best practices that can serve as examples and inspiration for others. And we hope these webinars stir new ideas, innovations, and new collaborations that will lead to sustainability solutions region-wide. Climate solutions and innovation play a crucial role in protecting the Great Lakes and their surrounding watersheds, which together make up one of the largest fresh surface water systems in the world. And key to achieving the ambitious climate goals is the leadership and coordinated efforts of the region's numerous jurisdictions. To explore if these jurisdictions share alignment for a unified vision for climate action in the Great Lakes region, a team of researchers from the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability set out to investigate by reviewing a selection of priority climate action plans that were submitted to the US Environmental Protection Agency. And today we will hear about this research and its findings, as well as gain some insight on the inception and implementation of Michigan's Climate Action Plan, one of several that was reviewed as part of the university study. In the Great Lakes, a region of this scale, coordinated efforts across the various authorities are essential for achieving regional sustainability goals. The Great Lakes region includes 2 federal governments, 8 US states, 2 Canadian provinces, thousands of local governments, and many First Nations. Within them are major industries that provide tens of millions of jobs across the region, contributing to the Great Lakes region being the economic powerhouse of North America. Its economic power is matched by its environmental significance. The region is guardian to the Great Lakes system, which holds over 20% of the world's surface freshwater. We are extremely fortunate for the natural resources this region holds, and protecting them while supporting economic growth is at the core of the Council of the Great Lakes region's mission. The Council's program areas look at issues that are critical to the region, like topics like circular economy, where we are working to forge a future without waste in the Great Lakes, starting with plastic waste, water stewardship, where we are deepening information exchange on corporate water stewardship best practices, decarbonization, where we are collaborating to create measurable long-term impact in reducing emissions in the region, and food systems, where we are initiating dialogue on sustainable food production. I invite you to reach out to me if any of these program areas are of interest to you or your organizations. It's together with our partners that we are aligning and cultivating a regional voice on these important issue areas. And that brings us to today's webinar, where we are exploring areas of alignment on the climate action plans across the region. To present on some of the region's climate action plans in the US are 2 very exceptional guests. With us today are Liesl Clark and Julia Field, who will each present. Following their presentations, we will use the remainder of the time for Q&A. So should you have any questions for the speakers, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box. The Zoom chat will be open for the audience to communicate with each other, but questions intended for the speakers should be entered in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And that just helps us keep track of the questions coming in. And so with that, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Liesl Clark. Liesl is the University of Michigan's Director of Climate Action Engagement in the School for Environment and Sustainability. She leads the new initiative aimed at linking the university's expanding sustainability research, collaborations, and engagement with external partners to help accelerate climate action across the state of Michigan and beyond. And prior to that, Liesl served as director of Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. She chaired the Michigan Council on Climate Solutions and led the development of the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. And she oversaw the research that we are going to hear about today. So I'll hand it over to Liesl. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. And it's such a perfect setup for the conversation we're having today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Great. So thanks again for the invitation and for the opportunity to share this work that we did at the university. So again, my name is Liesl Clark, Director of Climate Action Engagement at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. The title of the report that we put out was Life is Better by the Lakes. We were looking at how the Great Lakes region is responding to EPA calls for leadership to climate action. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about the way that EPA had approached the climate planning, what we did as a team of researchers, and then describe a bit about our findings and take us into our next steps, which will be a really nice setup for Julia. She and I have actually done this a couple of times already. So you may be familiar with the EPA Climate Pollution Reduction Grants, or commonly referred to as the CPRG, or you may not, and you will be by the end of the conversation today. The Climate Pollution Reduction Plan grant was created by the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Congress just a couple of years ago. It set aside a chunk of money for planning grants, and those were formulaic dollars that were distributed to the states and to MSAs and to tribal jurisdictions for their work. And then what culminates in all of this, and it's actually kind of unique from the timeline because we're going to be able to tell you the whole timeline, was the result of the competitive grants that EPA has issued, which just came out this week. So all of it is coming together really nicely for the presentation today. I'm sure that's why EPA did it. So part of the climate pollution reduction grant plans was the starting point, which was the formulaic dollars that supported the primary climate action plan. So those were all submitted March 1st of 2024. And that is the basis for the summary work that we did at the university. It's important to understand that the timeline that EPA gave the jurisdictions for submitting those plans was very brief. And so one of the things that we saw in the summary was that states or jurisdictions that had already been doing work around climate planning were obviously a bit ahead of jurisdictions that had not done as much work. Now, that's all right because it gets everybody to the same place with submitting the plan to EPA. But that was a pretty quick turnaround. And so it was pretty obvious in the plans, the distinction between where you'd seen more work done, where people were just getting kind of acclimated. What was submitted in the PSAP was a simplified greenhouse gas inventory, quantified greenhouse gas reduction measures, and that's a place where we spent most of our time in the course of the summary. Low-income and disadvantaged community benefits analysis, also referred to as LIDAC. Those were not submitted across the board, but there were a lot of good materials there. And then also a review of the local authority to implement the measures that were articulated. When we think about the full supply chain or the full value chain, I guess I should say, of how this plan is going to work, how the EPA's program is going to work, what this leads up to is both the competitive grants that we're going to tell you a little bit about at the end today, but also the comprehensive climate action plan. So the priority climate action plan, again, is what we were looking at and what was submitted in March. Now, jurisdictions are preparing their comprehensive climate action plan. So that will go into much more detail. So for example, in the PSAPs that we looked at, they They simplified and focused on a few key measures, and they did that in order to set themselves up for the competitive grant dollars. When we see the comprehensive climate action plans out in 2 years, or actually about a year and a half now, they're going to be much more robust because there's been more time to put them together and because they are more comprehensive. So that's going to be really interesting data as well, and something that we'll be looking for. I left this slide in even though the competitive grants were announced earlier this week, just because I thought it would be useful to understand how this process worked in order to get to the 4.5 billion. So the formulaic dollars for the PSAPs that then set up those jurisdictions to file for the competitive grants. And I think it's great that Julia is going to be here from the Michigan perspective to give us more Michigan detail. And also, not to steal her thunder, but it's pretty exciting that all of their work that went into this resulted in them being awarded money under the competitive side. So not every state submitted a PSAP. So this is a slide from EPA showing who submitted the PSAPs and who didn't. There were also obviously a lot of cities and metropolitan statistical areas, and then a lot of tribal communities or jurisdictions that are represented here. So Laura's setup is a really excellent one for how we decided to approach this summary. When she talks about the $6 trillion economic value estimate for the Great Lakes region, making the Great Lakes region potentially the third largest economic region in the world. Of course, the fact that we are home to more than 20% of the world's fresh surface water and our beautiful Great Lakes, like that's a perfect reason that we chose to take a look at a boundary around the Great Lakes region. So what did we do? We looked at 6 state plans. We looked at 7 city plans, and then we looked at 3 tribal plans. And for those of you that are familiar with the EPA structure, you'll probably also notice that these are the Region 5 states. So they are not as comprehensive as Laura's description of the Great Lakes state. We don't have New York or Pennsylvania here, for example. And they also don't include our neighbors to the north, which of course are incredible, important part of that, of this value area of the Great Lakes Basin. But it's just because of the jurisdiction of US EPA, of course. There's a lot of great work happening there too. I'd like this slide in particular because it overlays the Great Lakes Basin with the natural boundaries of our ecology with the more concrete boundaries of our political jurisdictions. And I think that it helps represent that overlap and then describing the participating tribes that we reviewed as well. So the climate plan submitted in 6 key sectors, and these are the sectors that are very parallel to what you see in climate planning processes, both across the US as well as globally. So no shocker, electricity generation, transportation or mobility, the built environment or buildings, industry, agricultural and natural working lands, and waste management. And that is the way that the measures were calculated and communicated back to EPA through the priority climate action plans. So what were our findings when we looked across all of those areas? You won't be surprised by some of the core themes that we saw. The first is that in order to do climate work, it's critical to build trust and support. This is really apparent in each of the sectors. You can take, for example, mobility. And as we're deploying additional public transit, thinking about different ways of getting around, doing things like increasing our electrified vehicle fleet, all of that requires working directly with people and getting people used to change and building that trust that's necessary. Another great example is development of renewable energy, deployment, either wind, solar, batteries, any of the different types of resources. It's a different type of deployment than a centralized fossil fuel plant, for example, and again, requires additional relationship building, community work, building of trust and support. Again, no surprise, utilizing financial incentives effectively. So there are a lot of conversations about the different types of financial incentives that are out there. I think that we saw through a lot of the different jurisdictions filings that they're trying to think creatively about how do you stack those financial incentives? So how do you think about piecing them together in a way that's most constructive for the project that you're trying to execute? How do you also put together potentially federal incentives, state incentives, maybe local incentives with private capital, with foundation dollars, with different ways of putting these mechanisms together in order to be successful? Of course, collaboration is key. So we saw this. Actually, Julie and I did a session for the Michigan Climate Conference. And one of the questions that we got was, all these different jurisdictions are planning. Isn't this just too much planning? Isn't everybody just doing the same thing? And what was interesting to hear from the participants on the panel who represented some of the MSAs, a couple of states, and some of the tribal communities was that they found that the planning was really fruitful because it created additional cross-pollination that wasn't happening before. So, for example, one of the cities said, we work to nest all of our climate planning in the higher level, the state's climate planning. And we can hear more from Julia about this, but from a state perspective, there's only so much detail you can get into, right? Where you really need, the rubber meets the road when it comes to local communities. That's really where deployment happens. And so collaboration is incented and supported by that planning. And finally, again, I don't think a surprise to anybody in the climate space, workforce development is key. We have so many different areas of climate action where we really are lacking the workforce that we need. And in a lot of cases, it's that there is a skill set out there and it just needs additional upskilling. In some cases, it's a matter of bringing additional professional skill sets to the table. So there are a lot of different ways to look at the workforce and talent growth that we need to do. It is, looks different, for example, for energy efficiency deployment than it does for renewable deployment. I think one of the things that was very apparent to me, both in the climate planning review process and then also just in some of the daily work that I do, is that almost every job in the future is going to be a green job or a climate-based job. There's going to be aspects to it in all that we do. So it's a matter of how do we work through existing mechanisms to get those skill sets to our people? And how do we create the right new mechanisms in order to make sure that we're educating that workforce talent for the future? So I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking through some of the categories that we spent more time with. So buildings, for example. When we looked at the building areas, there were some common measures that are pretty standard across building work. So certainly measurement is critical. If we're not measuring, we don't know how to really move the needle. Energy efficiency targets through weatherization programs, through setting of targets in legislation or regulatory processes. And then a lot of conversation in the Great Lakes plans in particular around how do we think about electrification of heating systems? Because we live in a colder climate, and so that is going to require additional work in order to make sure that we do it in a just way that moves the needle for everybody. On the innovative side, Cleveland in particular did a really deep dive on incentive stacking. It was really fascinating and certainly worth looking at if it's something that you're interested in. And I think not just for thinking about it from an energy efficiency perspective, but I think it's also informative more broadly for financial stacking as well. And then we saw in Minnesota in particular, here's a call out, but we also saw this in some other places, the partnering of decarbonization work with decreasing pollution as well. And so here it was indoor air quality improvement for LIDAC communities, but we saw it in other ways. Certainly it shows up in transportation as well as electrification or the power sector. So looking at the power sector, the power sector was really interesting because, again, this example of different policies based on how far and how much work states or jurisdictions had done was pretty apparent. We did see a divided focus. So Wisconsin's a great example of this because in the Milwaukee plan, there was talk of utility scale renewable development, and the Wisconsin plan had a unique focus on distributed generation community solar. And I know that's gotten a lot of interest in Wisconsin as they're, stepping up their clean energy work. But certainly varied approaches around targets and pace of implementation. Some of the unique callouts. Modeling of CEJA, which is I don't know if I can do the acronym, Clean Energy and Jobs Act. There we go. I got there. Which was the Illinois legislation that was passed a couple of years ago. What they did in their plan was they looked at how to specifically support small utilities as they were working to meet the CEJA targets. And so that was a unique way to approach it, and I thought really interesting. Renewable ready communities in Michigan. So this is a great way that Michigan has been working to support community engagement. So it's dollars that the state of Michigan made available in the last budget cycle. And I think you'll hear more about it from Julia, to support the siting work that's happening on the ground. Again, not to quote Tip O'Neill, all politics is local, all energy transition work is local as well. So supporting that local conversation and working to make sure that where we're doing deployments, it's done with the support of the community in the best economic interest of the community. And then another LIDAC angle from Detroit. I was really impressed by this piece too. Detroit brought the energy burden, energy cost question into the equation. And in their measures noted that they were focused on limiting energy costs to no more than 6% of annual income. And so I thought, again, that was a unique approach that we were intrigued to see. Transportation or mobility. No shocker here that you see a target on the reduction of need for travel. So increase in alternative modes and in public transit. Certainly efficiency of the existing transportation that we have, small, medium, and heavy duty when we talk about vehicular, but also, of course, sustainable aviation fuel and other approaches for other methods of transportation. And one of the key ways is for enhancing vehicle efficiency and fuel efficiency is through stricter fuel standards, but of course also through technology improvements. Ohio had a neat approach here around their Safe Routes to School program, where they were funding K-12 students to look at different ways to get around. And so certainly supporting bike to school, for example, was a neat angle. And then SEMCOG, who some of you in Michigan may be familiar with. SEMCOG is the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments. They submitted a plan and looked at deploying hydrogen for their public fleets. So again, we're seeing some pretty unique measures here that really demonstrate different jurisdictions wanting to step forward and advance issues around climate action. So just to make sure we have enough time to hear from Julia, I wanted to mention quickly some of our next steps. So we looked at 3 sectors for the Great Lakes region. This team is interested, for example, in analyzing all 6 sectors of that data. There's also an opportunity to expand the geography. We looked at the Great Lakes. You could look at any of the 10 EPA regions or split it in different ways. I've had conversations with faculty members who are interested in interviewing authors of the plan and understanding how the planning came together and then what do they see for the comprehensive climate plan going forward. There was, in the PSAPs, there was some conversation around implementing authority, but this one's gotten a lot of airtime, particularly in Wisconsin, for example. The states can set out their measures, but what implementing authority do they need? So do they need changes in legislation, regulatory authority in order to actually do or meet the commitments that they've set out? That would be really interesting. But then, any number of things here, deeper data analysis. The comprehensive climate action plans are going to have much more robust data behind their greenhouse gas emissions. And then one of the things that we've talked a bit about at the university that I think could be a good next step too, is setting up a large language model and using our unique capacity at the university around AI to be ready to analyze the comprehensive climate action plans. The report that we did, the summary there, represents more than 2,000 pages of material that was reviewed. That's a lot of material. If we think about how to do the cuts in a different way, using something like a large language model could be a real asset in moving with speed to get learning from the climate plans. So before I hand it over to Julia, I do want to say thank you. I had a lot of great faculty that were involved in this at the School for Environment Sustainability, and it was supported financially through the Herb Institute, which is the combination of SEAS and the Ross School of Business. And I do also have to say that the SEAS communication team is amazing and does wonderful graphics work. So that's my shout out to them. And this is the team of us who did this work together. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to questions after you get a chance to hear from Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Liesl. Really interesting to hear the breakdown of your research, and definitely important to understand where there's common ground at play with those action plans. And we'll definitely be staying in touch to hear about those next steps once those start getting implemented. But before we tackle questions that are coming in for your presentation, we're going to hear from Julia on the inception and implementation of Michigan's Climate Action Plan. Julia is the Deputy Climate and Energy Advisor in the Office of Climate and Energy at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Prior to that, she worked for the Michigan Climate and Health Adaptation Program in the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the DC Department of Energy and Environment, and the US EPA. So Julia, it's so nice to have you with us today, and really looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Laura, and for the Council of the Great Lakes Regions for hosting this webinar today. And Liesl, what a great setup to give an overview of the CPRG program. And I really appreciated the report that your team put together. It was really interesting to read what other states and entities in our region put together for their CPRG priority climate action plans. I will start to share my screen. All right, hopefully you're looking at my slides. I'm sure some will come off mute if I have the wrong thing shared. So again, I'm Julia Field. I'm the Deputy Climate and Energy Advisor in the Office of Climate and Energy at EGLE. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about the state of Michigan's My Healthy Climate Plan and how we leveraged the EPA's CPRG program to further implement our climate plan. So an executive directive from Governor Whitmer in 2020 charged EGLE through the Office of Climate and Energy to develop the My Healthy Climate Plan. And it was based on extensive public and stakeholder input and published in 2022. It's a mitigation-focused plan that also encourages climate adaptation. And it's focused on 6 action areas, or what we refer to as pillars of the plan. And that is a commitment to environmental justice and pursuing a just transition, cleaning the electric grid, electrifying vehicles and increasing public transit, repairing and decarbonizing homes and businesses, driving clean innovation in industry, and finally, protecting Michigan's land and water. 3 overarching goals of the plan are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 52% by 2030, and then to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 and maintain net negative greenhouse gas emissions thereafter. And throughout all of our work, it's important to us that we address environmental injustices related to climate, and it's a key tenet of the work that we do. On the right, you'll see an infographic with the many engagements and input sessions that went into creating the climate plan. We had 17 Council on Climate Solutions meetings dedicated to this plan, 2 consultations with tribal governments. We heard from a number of experts around climate planning, held 6 topical work groups. Then we received up to 2,000 public comments on the draft plan, and then held a number of listening sessions throughout 2021 and 2022. And so when we received the EPA's CPRG planning grant of $3 million, we were able to really leverage work that we'd already done. And we saw this funding opportunity as a tool to help us accelerate the implementation of the My Healthy Climate Plan. Liesl already gave a great overview of what was involved in this CPRG program, but through the planning grant, we had to first work on that priority climate action plan, which was due in March. And now we're in that phase of the comprehensive climate action planning process, which will be due to the EPA next summer. And this is a 5-year grant program, so it'll close in 2027, at which point we'll submit a status report. And it was really important to us to work on this priority climate action plan because, as Liesl explained, the next stage of it was this competitive implementation grant that we could apply to if we wrote it around a priority action measure included in the priority climate action plan. I do want to say I really think this EPA grant program is an incredible opportunity. It sparked climate action planning across the United States. And so for states and entities that didn't have a climate action plan, it helped them create their first climate action plan. And then for states like Michigan, where we already had an existing plan, we were really able to further our work and deepen our analysis to improve our plan. All right, so as I said, with this planning grant, we did not start from scratch. We were able to leverage existing input and engagements we had that went into the My Healthy Climate planning process. But it did allow us to deepen our quantitative understanding. So we did a lot around our greenhouse gas inventory that we weren't able to do in the first My Healthy Climate plan. And it also deepened our qualitative understanding. So the My Healthy Climate plan, written primarily between 2020 and 2022, it was the peak of COVID. And so they were really limited on what they could do in terms of in-person engagements. And when we got this grant from EPA, we were able to kind of do a tour of Michigan to meet in person with communities and talk about the My Healthy Climate plan and hear from them what they were interested in terms of climate planning. So from these inputs, it helped us create our priority greenhouse gas reduction measures, which we then analyzed in terms of the greenhouse gas impacts and the potential community benefits. And finally, this helped us create the priority climate action plan. So as I said, this process allowed us to continue engagement with existing partnerships, primarily through the Council on Climate Solutions, as well as the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, as well as work we've been doing with other state of Michigan departments and agencies around climate. But this process also helped us to facilitate new collaborations. So we met biweekly with the MSAs that received planning grants in Michigan, the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, SEMCOG, and the Grand Valley Metro Council. And this was a really neat opportunity to increase our regional coordination with the major metros in Michigan, as well as another avenue for increased engagement with local governments. And we also met biweekly with the tribes in Michigan that received planning grants. And this was a great opportunity to increase our coordination and collaboration around climate and energy planning with tribes. All right, so this is kind of an overview of what our engagement timeline looked like. As Liesl said, it was a really fast process. We really started in earnest in fall 2023, and then that priority climate action plan was due in March. So we started in September with a request for information on what the community engagement should look like for this planning process, and to hear what ideas people had for implementation of the My Healthy Climate plan. We also launched a webinar series in October, and then throughout November and December, we had a call for projects that was open to solicit project ideas that were related to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then we held those in-person engagement sessions. Those sessions were held in Detroit, Grand Rapids, Flint, Marquette, and then they ended in Petoskey. And at those events, we gave an overview of the My Healthy Climate plan, as well as those led into interactive discussions around potential barriers and solutions to achieving our goals in the plan. We held 2 virtual sessions, which were more of an open forum comment period to discuss how to prioritize the implementation of the My Healthy Climate plan. And from there, gathered further input from state of Michigan stakeholders. And all this culminated in publishing the plan in March, and then kind of celebrating it at our annual My Healthy Climate conference in May. These are just some photos from one of our engagement sessions. I believe this one was in Grand Rapids, and I'll say that personally, these sessions were a highlight of our whole planning process. It also happened to coincide with, I think, my first week on the job with EGLE. And so it was a whirlwind tour around the state, but it was really great to hear from the public directly and from communities what they were excited about in our climate plan and what they thought barriers were to implementation. So from all of those different engagements and input opportunities, we gathered around 800 ideas for how to create these priority measures in our priority climate action plan. So we had to create a process to decide what we're actually going to include. So we collected and sorted these ideas, kind of aggregating by theme. We then looked to how they aligned with the My Healthy Climate Plan strategies. Part of this was ensuring that they'd be replicable and scalable across the state. We wouldn't be able to focus on super local solutions for a statewide plan. We further categorized and combined similar ideas. And then finally, we started to dig into some of the quantification. So looking at the potential greenhouse gas emission reductions through these measures, as well as some of the community benefits analysis, focusing primarily on benefits analyses for low-income and disadvantaged communities. And finally, we selected 10 measures to include in our priority climate action plan based on all this analysis. So in March, we published the plan. As I said earlier, what we included that we didn't have in our previous My Healthy Climate Plan was an updated 2024 greenhouse gas inventory. This was actually the first updated inventory since 2005. So it was a really great opportunity to dig deeper into our quantitative analysis of greenhouse gas emissions. We focused on the key sectors around electricity generation, commercial and residential buildings, transportation, and industry. We did not look at the waste sector or natural and working lands sector. We'll look at that in our comprehensive climate action planning process. And then across those sectors, as I said, we had those 10 priority action measures. And within each of those measures, we included an estimated emissions reduction. We looked at the low-income and disadvantaged community benefits analysis. It included some qualitative and quantitative analysis looking at potential co-pollutant reductions, as well as other potential impacts on health and well-being. We considered how these measures intersected with other funding opportunities, specifically federal and state funding opportunities. And we started some preliminary workforce planning analysis, looking at existing workforce numbers, and in some instances, looking at estimates and projections of potential workforce needs. I'll try to give just kind of a high-level overview of the 10 measures, but encourage you all, if you're interested, to please look up our Priority Climate Action Plan, which you can find online. I'll drop a link in the chat at the end of this. But in terms of the electricity sector, the overarching My Healthy Climate Plan goal here is to reach 60% renewable energy by 2030. Two measures that we think will help us get at least part of the way there are to drive the deployment of renewable energy and energy storage across the state, and to also invest in grid scale storage and grid investments to enable earlier coal plant retirements. For the building sector, the My Healthy Climate Plan goal, overarching goal, is to reduce emissions related to heating Michigan homes and buildings by 17% by 2030. The three priority measures for this sector include driving building electrification and fuel switching, especially in homes with delivered fuels, and to reduce household fossil energy use through home repairs, electric upgrades, weatherization, and energy waste reduction efforts. And finally, to decarbonize government and nonprofit facilities as a sort of lead by example measure. For the transportation sector, a My Healthy Climate Plan goal is to reach 2 million electric vehicles on roads by 2030. Three measures for this sector include electrifying public fleets, with particular emphasis on fleets in low-income and disadvantaged communities, to also support public transit and non-motorized transportation options, and finally, to encourage adoption of electric vehicles by increasing the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, again, with an emphasis on low-income and disadvantaged communities. And finally, in terms of the industrial sector, we focused on encouraging industrial innovation to advance energy efficiency, fuel switching, and deployment of cleaner manufacturing technologies, and also to reduce food waste and capture emissions and implement technologies and practices to reduce methane from wastewater treatment. So as Liesl talked about the kind of competitive grant side of the CPRG program, after we published the plan in March, we needed to sprint to turn around a grant application by April 1st for that competitive grant funding. And we recognize that as a state, deploying renewable energy is our #1 priority to achieving our renewable energy goals that then further enable economy-wide decarbonization. And we heard the importance of this measure through the stakeholder input that we conducted throughout the planning process, and we felt affirmed that this is a #1 priority. So when it came time to apply for that CPRG competitive grant, we decided to apply around funds that address barriers to deploying renewable energy driven by analysis for this planning process. And I am very excited to announce that Monday of this week, we found out that we were one of 25 applications awarded nationwide. I believe there were close to 300 applications from states, municipalities, regional entities, tribal governments that applied. And so we were really thrilled to be one of a few that was selected, and we're very excited about that opportunity. For a little more information around the grant that we're actually awarded, so we applied for and received $129.1 million, and it'll help us launch the Renewables Ready Communities program at EGLE. And so this will help us expand the Renewables Ready Communities Awards pilot, which is an initiative that was launched in 2024 with a one-time state investment of $30 million. And it provides financial incentives to local and tribal governments that approve and host utility-scale renewable energy and energy storage through local processes. We'll also be able to create a new brownfield renewable energy pilot program in the Brownfield Redevelopment Program at EGLE. And this will help provide grants for renewable energy projects on brownfields. It will also help us to further fund EGLE's Renewable Energy Academy, which creates technical assistance materials for local and tribal governments to improve the planning, siting, and permitting processes needed for renewable energy facilities. And this will also develop materials for our Brownfield Renewable Energy Pilot Program. And we'll also further fund workforce development programs at the state in partnership with the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. And this will allow us to train the workforce needed to build the renewable energy projects to meet our 2030 goals. And finally, we did reserve $10 million of this grant award for renewable energy projects in tribal communities through either that Renewables Ready Communities Award program or through the Brownfield Renewable Energy Pilot. So in addition to now launching the Renewables Ready Communities program, which we're very focused on right now, and that will be done in partnership with EGLE's Energy Services Unit and the Brownfield Redevelopment Program, our office is focusing on our comprehensive climate action planning process to turn that into EPA by next summer. And again, we're seeing this as an opportunity to leverage this funding to accelerate the implementation of the My Healthy Climate Plan and kind of further some of our analysis. First, we'll be looking at deepening the quantitative analysis on the greenhouse gas inventory. We'll add targets and projections to those calculations and start to expand some of the benefits analyses that we did for low-income and disadvantaged communities in the Priority Climate Action Plan to look at all communities affected by particular measures. And we'll add in analysis of the waste sector and the natural and working land sectors that we did not include in the previous Priority Climate Action Plan. We'll also continue the meaningful coordination we had with tribes and the MSAs and local governments throughout the planning process of the PCAP, as well as look for new engagement opportunities. And we'll be launching a few more in-person engagement sessions through the rest of 2024 and early 2025. And those sessions will be really focused on the pillars of our climate plan to kind of dig a little deeper into pillar-specific goals and barriers and solutions. And then finally, we'll also do a little bit more analysis. We started with some preliminary workforce planning, but we'll do a deeper analysis of the workforce needs to reach our goals, as well as continuing to look at other federal and state funding opportunities we can use to leverage the implementation of these goals. Let's see. And then what else do I want to say on this? Just in general, again, very appreciative of the CPRG program. It really helped us as a state to collaborate and engage around climate planning. It really improved our quantitative analysis that was started in the My Healthy Climate Plan and provided us opportunities for public engagement that we didn't necessarily have before. And for that, I am very, very grateful. And so all of this works together with the other initiatives that we have in our office that are all tied to the My Healthy Climate Plan and implementing the plan in the state. Right, a few opportunities that may be of interest. We have the Justice 40 Technical Assistance Program that we're launching with the Office of Environmental Justice and Public Advocate is open to nonprofits and it closes August 1st. We won awards through EPA Solar for All program to implement the My Solar for All program here in Michigan. We're in the planning period, so a bit more to come this year and early next. We launched the My Healthy Climate Corps, which is part of the first American Climate Corps effort. That launched in March and we'll be starting our second cohort in the fall. We just closed our application for host sites, but we'll be opening our application for members in August. And a big thing of what we do each year is our My Healthy Climate Conference. And so we had ours in May in Lansing, and next year it will be in Detroit in April. And with that, I'll turn it over and see if there's any questions for Liesl and I.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julia. That was really interesting to hear your journey. And it really, I think, shows the level of like work and coordination that goes into developing those plans. And congratulations again to you and to the team at EGLE on the grant funding that was just announced. So well done. So we have about 15 minutes left. So we will move into some questions that have come in, and I'm going to start with one that came in with our registration, and it's similar to one that has just come in live. The one that came in live is from James, and he says the Great Lakes Commission is currently working on a climate commitment issue brief for each Great Lakes state and province. This incorporates CPRG emission reduction targets. How do you see the Great Lakes ensuring cross-boundary collaboration to achieve these aggressive goals? And the question that came in with registration was asking about key lessons from Michigan or from the other plans, how they can be shared with neighboring jurisdictions in both the US and Canada. So really that's for cross-border, cross-jurisdiction information sharing and collaboration. So would either of you like to touch on that?
I could probably start because it might fit more in my world than Julia's, although Michigan does a great job of collaborating. Collaboration across state boundaries, as well as, again, with our neighbors to the north, is going to be really a critical part of implementation here. And I think there are some great bodies that already facilitate that, like Council of Great Lakes Regions, as well as the international connection between the two, the binational connection. Like there's a variety, the IJC, there's a variety of organs that I think help facilitate that cross-pollination. And I think that we need to make sure that we've got tribal nations at the table for all of those conversations because of the importance that they play in moving these pieces forward. And so that collaboration is going to be critical. That is one of the reasons that we were interested in doing the summary. I was having conversations with my colleagues in other states who said, we don't have time to read all of these, but we want to know where are the innovative steps, where are places that there can be an example of imitation as the sincerest form of flattery, right? How do we pick that up and just run with it? So that was one of the reasons that we were interested in doing this. There are other efforts that are looking across multiple climate plans that I think will be additive to that narrative. But I think, there's more work to do in this space. Frankly, there's so much work to do in this space that there's room for all of us at the table, which I think is a really good thing.
I'll just add that while we're more focused on Michigan and governments within Michigan around this climate planning process, because it was a nationwide program to receive the planning grants, it has increased our collaboration, especially with neighboring states like Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it's really helpful to share ideas, and even reading the other PCAPs to understand what people applied around is really informing what we're looking at for our comprehensive climate action planning process as well.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, that alignment is so important. Another question that came in regarding the plans is, how are the physical climate risk and resiliency captured in those plans? Was that something that you came across?
I can start. Because the whole climate pollution reduction grant program, kind of in the name, it's a really mitigation focused program, and they really wanted the priority climate action plans to focus on greenhouse gas emissions, and the competitive grant awards were focused on what could have the biggest impact for emissions reductions. Obviously, resiliency wasn't the focus, but we were able to highlight measures that had co-benefits, including resiliency. So we kind of incorporated that qualitatively in our priority reduction measures. And I think in the comprehensive climate action planning period, we can again take a look at how to make sure we include the resilience benefits of some of the measures, just so we're able to capture those benefits as well.
Great, thank you, Julia. Going back to the collaboration and cross-border, I guess touching on cross-industry and cross-sector collaboration, one of the questions is, sorry, I just lost it. There it is. What can businesses do to partner with and support EGLE and Michigan healthy climate efforts? And I guess that's not just Michigan, but also across the region.
I'll start, and then maybe Liesl will have ideas. And I'm curious also from your time at EGLE, Liesl, if you'll have ideas. We have really ambitious and necessary goals in our climate plan, and it's going to take everyone who wants to be involved. And so I'd say if you're a business interested in supporting these efforts, making sure to sign up for our listserv and paying attention to what efforts we have ongoing, and maybe responding to a call for projects or responding to our requests for information, and hopefully being able to attend some of our in-person engagement sessions and webinars that we host. As I said, we're in that CCAP planning process, or the comprehensive climate action planning process. We'll be doing in-person sessions, and I think that may be of interest to some business stakeholders. So just paying attention to what opportunities we have, and hopefully participating.
Yeah, I think that's a great description, Julia, of places where there's concrete opportunities for overlap. When I think about the business engagement in the climate action space, I think about it in a couple of big categories. So one of the big categories is decision-making that businesses make on their own, right? So telling, your facilities and operations folks that you want to make sure that you're looking at your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. Asking specifically for carbon-free types of generation, supporting energy efficiency work and supply chain greening for your own company, I think is one really great example of something that's really necessary, like within your own boundaries. And then there are certainly opportunities to provide goods and services that support the climate action work that's necessary. And we've got a lot of, great businesses in Michigan, as well as across the Great Lakes region, that work in that space. And then there are companies that aren't necessarily big users of energy or producers of goods and services in the climate space that care about it. That, again, their commitment to renewable purchasing, their commitment to energy efficiency, their interest in being a B Corp, and them talking very publicly about how important climate action is. That's really a critical part of what we're doing. And can't say enough about how important it is for businesses to speak up and act in all three of those categories. And I'm thinking about some of the breweries and wineries and things that companies that you wouldn't necessarily immediately equate with climate, but care deeply about climate because of how it impacts them and how it's going to impact future generations. And so being active in any of those spaces is really important, and we're grateful for all of that work.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll also sort of plug in the Council of the Great Lakes region, because our programs are working across sectors and across borders and really trying to engage businesses in those topic areas that we can really connect and work collaboratively together to sort of move the needle on some of these areas. So reach out to the Council of the Great Lakes region too. Okay, another question that I saw has come in, which is an interesting one, is from Peter, and he asks, from the 35,000-foot view, what are the biggest data gaps that still keep you up at night?
I'll go again and curious what other plans maybe indicated something here. So we use a lot of models from the EPA that use some default data, and then tracking down the state-specific data can be pretty tricky. I think one that I'm really interested in that we hope to dig into for the comprehensive climate action planning process is around buildings and understanding where exactly in the building sector are our emissions coming from. And we just haven't been able to find, well, I think we know where the data sets are. We just haven't been able to dig into that work just yet. So it doesn't keep me up at night, but I'm excited to see the results through our CCAP planning process.
So not specifically a data thing, but when I think about the climate work that's in front of us, the thing that I think we need to spend the most time and focus on is workforce and talent development. I just think, you can look at the progress that we're making in the power grid. You can look at progress in mobility. You can look at progress in buildings and energy efficiency. All of it requires a talented workforce in order to be able to do that work. And when I think about the upskilling that's necessary and the creation of the new workforce and the amount of need that I'm hearing from employers in that space, it's really critical, both on certainly on the for-profit side, on the private side with deployment, but then, also in the government and NGO world in the work that we need to do. So that's certainly first and foremost in my mind.
Excellent. Thank you. And one more, I guess, that's following. It's more specific to waste management data. So I'm not sure if you where you stand with this, but the question is, what was the most surprising fact that you learned as you explored the waste management data?
Yeah, I think I can do that one because I know Michigan is still working on their response, and that'll be part of their comprehensive. So we saw responses in Indiana, Minnesota, and Ohio with more detail around waste management, and it was really covering the gamut. You saw some things on waste to energy. You saw initiatives that were going to increase the amount of recycling and materials management work, and then you saw deployment for composting type programs in order to get food waste out of the system, because we all know that that's a really important part of action steps forward. And so we saw some examples in those state plans. And then there were also some examples, for example, in the tribal plans as well, in the tribal jurisdictions. So we'll see more of that in the upcoming CCAP, but that's a great flag about how important waste management is for climate activity and for the numbers in the future.
Great. Thanks, Liesl. And we are just about out of time, so I'm going to ask one more question, and it's regarding the funding and the programs. The individual Martin wants to understand if there's vulnerability to the funding and policy direction changes if based on November elections. So in terms of, I guess, the funding that's been awarded, is there any vulnerability to that, or is that secure?
Well, that Marty Kuchler always gets to the core question, that guy. No, Marty's totally hitting the nail on the head. I think that it would be presumptuous of any of us on this call to assume we know what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks based on what the last 2 weeks have been, let alone in the next 2 months and 2 years. But his point is well taken, which is that policy matters, voting matters, candidates matter. And knowing people's commitment to climate action is really important as we go into a very important election cycle this fall.
Great answer. Well, I'm afraid that we are out of time. So Liesl, Julia, thank you so much for being part of today's webinar and sharing your direct experience with us. And thank you for all your work on leading climate action. It's really important what you're doing. I also want to thank the Fred A. and Barbara M. Erb Family Foundation. They provide funding to the Council of the Great Lakes region for our Business and Sustainability Network, which this webinar series is a part of. And thank you to the audience who submitted questions. I know we weren't able to get to all of them, but we will take a look through them. And if we're able to answer them after the webinar, I will coordinate with our speakers to do so. Our next webinar is on August 29th, looking at what the private sector can do to support biodiversity in the Great Lakes. So I hope everyone will be able to attend that webinar. But until then, have a great rest of your day. And Julia, Liesl, thank you again so much.